Okay, let's get started. So my name is Dr. Alyssa Counsell. I'm an assistant professor at the Ryerson University in Toronto. I have my email address listed on this first slide here, as well as my Twitter handle, and I posted a link to a copy of these slides in the chat as well, if you would like a copy of them. So I do have the Google captions on for Google Slides. Hopefully that's more helpful for accessibility than it is distracting, given that there's so many people attending from all over the world. I thought it would be helpful. So the title of my talk today is Student Attitudes Towards Learning Statistics with R, Is It Worth It? Before beginning with my talk, I would like to make a land acknowledgement. Ryerson University is in Toronto, and Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee peoples that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. However, in line with some discussions about DEI in the session yesterday, I would like to more than simply acknowledge the land on which we're settlers, and instead to call attention to the racism that Indigenous folks of Turtle Island, the original name for Canada, continue to experience. So I'm taking this opportunity to remind myself and invite others to reflect on how our actions and policies continue to harm Indigenous folks, and also to think about how we can support Indigenous movements and work towards reconciliation with these communities. In terms of the session agenda for today, this one's going to be a little bit different from some of the previous talks that we've seen. Pre-COVID, it was originally put forth as a much more interactive session with the goal of having the first half as a research talk and the second half as a discussion period. Once we moved to a virtual format, my original plan was for breakout rooms, but we had so many registrants that that just wasn't feasible. So instead, we're going to opt for a small panel and try to incorporate in questions from the audience from the Q&A and bring that in as well. So hopefully this works. We'll see how it goes, but I ask you to bear with us. I'm going to start off with the importance of statistical software, which I think is appropriate given the polls and a lot of the conversations that we've been having throughout this conference so far. I don't think it's controversial to say that statistical software is a necessary skill for analyzing data in psychology, but there continues to be a lot of debate about software in psychology stats courses, for example, whether to use in introductory courses or not. I guess 83% of us say that, or whatever that number was, say that it should be. Regardless of personal opinion or the particular ideas of the folks here today, the guidelines for assessment and instruction in statistical education that was put forth by the American Statistical Association do recommend including software in introductory courses. Then, of course, the next question is, well, which software? Of course, there are numerous packages available for students, and over time, the options really seem to even be getting more numerous and even better. So SPSS continues to be the most popular choice for many instructors in psychology, but R, JASP, Jamovi, Excel, and some of these other packages continue to be reasonably popular or used more and more now. I do want to highlight a survey that was done by Davidson et al. In 2019, where these folks surveyed Canadian psychology departments and asked them what software, if any, are being used in their courses. And so I believe the results were something like 50% or a fair number of courses were not using any software at the introductory level. But of the ones that did, just like we saw in the poll a minute ago, SPSS was the most popular choice, whereas Excel was the second most popular choice and R was the third most popular choice. If you move to an intermediate undergraduate class or a sort of third or fourth year class, for example, the same pattern holds, except R was a bit more common than Excel from these particular data. But once you move to grad level courses, what you'll see is that R is being used significantly more. SPSS is still the top choice or the most popular software being used, but we do see a lot more courses incorporating in R. I also want to highlight some software trends or looking at some data that are not particular to psychology per se, but I think are interesting in terms of thinking about how software is changing over time. So if these data come from Google Scholar, and specifically the graphs and all of the results are coming from this particular blog on the popularity of data science software. It was updated in 2019, but I think the original was from 2012. And so if you look at the number of scholarly article citations for software in 2018, again, we see the same pattern that SPSS continues to remain the most popularly cited software amongst scholarly articles. But we can see that R is also reasonably popular. SAS is a little bit behind R, and then there's a number of other packages here as well. So this is just one snapshot for 2018. If instead we look at the graph here of looking at the trends over time, we can see that this red line here is for SPSS. So it was really increasing very rapidly up until around 2010. But then we see that the number of citations are really decreasing quite rapidly, as well as sort of a similar decreasing pattern past 2010 for SAS. And although it's a bit hard to see here from what we had earlier on, we can see that the citations for R are actually increasing over time, which I think is interesting as additional packages and features and additional accessibility and user friendliness of R continues to rise over time. So let's sort of turn our attention back to specifically using R in psychology stats courses. So for any of us who have talked to colleagues about incorporating R into our courses, and probably especially at the undergrad level, we've probably heard something along the lines of, students already have minimal stats background. They don't like stats. They have limited to no programming background. So R is just way too challenging or way too difficult for psychology students. And this is why we shouldn't incorporate it in. And so I wanted to ask the questions of like, well, what's the evidence specifically in favor of really saying, no, we should not be using this? And how do students feel about learning R in these stats courses? So I put together a study where we collected data in 2016 and 2017, specifically trying to examine students' attitudes towards statistics and using R across a few different study levels and over the course of a single statistics course in a semester. So we had 157 intro level undergrad students. We had 37 upper year undergraduate students and 50 graduate students participate. And so these data are published in a paper in Psychology Teaching Review in 2010. So I encourage you to look that up if you, 2020, not 2010. So if I encourage you to look those up if you would like further detail beyond what I talk about today. So I'm just going to highlight a few particular things. The study did end up using qualitative open-ended data as well as quantitative data. So I'm going to start with the qualitative data first. So these data were derived from just simply asking the question, do you feel that your attitudes towards statistics or R have changed? And if so, what would you say are the factors that really kind of came into play for that? And then we allowed for them to also put in any additional information they wanted to include. And so here I have just sort of the total frequency count out of 134 total participants from time 2, as well as the frequencies broken down by study level. And so I do want to note that post-grad, this paper was published in a British journal, so postgraduate is what we in Canada would refer to a grad student as. And so we can see those numbers by level as well as overall. And so some really common themes that came up about whether their attitudes shifted or not, and what really influenced that, is how comfortable or competent they felt using the software by the end of their course. And interestingly, most of the participants who brought up competence or comfort in any capacity were saying that they did feel comfortable using it by the end, or they did feel competent using it. So these numbers are higher than those saying that they did not feel competent. Instead, they were just really anxious and stressed, and that just never went away, and they still had that at the end of the course. So I think that was sort of a positive finding. Another really common theme that won't be surprising to us, for us as instructors who are here today, is the impact of your instructor, TA, course resources, things like that. So overwhelmingly, the students who said anything about the instructor said that they had a positive impact on helping their attitudes or helping improve their attitudes, whereas a minority also said that there was a negative impact. So this is something they specifically brought up. And then in terms of the ideas of talking about difficulty and how much students like this, definitely students tended to think that statistics or R was fairly difficult. And in general, they were more likely to say that they didn't enjoy it compared to that they did actually enjoy it, especially at the undergraduate level. And so what you'll notice is that as study level sort of progresses, and again, this is not longitudinal data where these are the same participants. These are snapshots of folks at different study levels, sorry. But the attitudes tend to improve sort of as you progress through more advanced courses as an undergraduate or a grad student. And so by the end of your undergrad or the beginning of your sort of grad career, there's not as large of a disproportion of students saying this is way too hard compared to it actually wasn't that hard, or I really didn't like this compared to I did like this. And the last thing that I want to highlight from the qualitative data here is that contrary to what a lot of other research has found, is that we didn't find that students said, I don't value statistics, or I don't value using software. They were much more likely of their own accord to say this was really useful, or this was highly valuable to me, compared to those saying that it really wasn't. And so now moving on to talk about some of the quantitative data associated with this study, we did ask targeted specific questions about attitudes or experiences using R specifically. And what I do also want to highlight or to have folks keep in the back of their mind as they're looking at these graphs is I have compiled this across the 3 different study levels, but the sample size for the undergrad introductory students is much larger than it is for the more advanced students. So keep sort of that in mind, that this is the majority of these students are introductory level students taking their first stats course in psychology. So if we look at this first bar chart on the left, these are the data for how folks responded to the question, how would you rate your attitudes towards R, where 1 is very negative, 7 is very positive, and 4 is sort of a true neutral. And the purple vertical lines that I have on each of these bar plots represents the mean for that particular item. So overall, despite people saying, yes, R or stats was difficult, and a fair number of students saying they didn't like it, if you just ask them to rate their attitudes overall, on average, they were sort of neutral to slightly positive, and there was a pretty fair number of participants who did rate them as as quite positive or very positive. And similarly, if you ask students about the degree to which they agree with the statement, I'm interested in learning more about data analysis in R, where 1 is strongly disagree and 7 is strongly agree, there's much more of a pileup on the right-hand side of this graph where students are saying that they agree or strongly agree that they would like to learn more about how to do this. Of course, there is still sort of a fair chunk of students who are disagreeing and are not really interested, but there's a much higher proportion of students who were interested in learning more compared to those who are not. Similarly, if we ask about their level of comfort and confidence, we see the same pileup on the right-hand side. So if we ask them, compared to the beginning of the course, where virtually all of the students had no experience using R whatsoever, asking them how much more comfortable they are, or asking them to agree whether they're more comfortable. Again, this huge pileup on the right, where by the end of the course, students were feeling pretty competent using the software, despite having very little previous experience. And if you ask them about how confident they are that they can carry out further analyses or find additional information about how to use R functions and packages, a really large proportion was saying that they did feel pretty confident or very confident. And this one I think was especially surprising to me, that so many students sort of built up enough of that level of self-efficacy to say that they were confident that they could continue to use the software in new applications. And then lastly, we asked students about how helpful they believe R would be in helping them to analyze their own data in the future or for getting a job. And once again, we see these negatively skewed distributions where students are generally saying that they think that the skills that they built learning R in their course would be helpful for either analyzing their own data or getting a job in the future. So overall, I would say that while not sort of a clear cut of everybody hates R or everybody loves R, the notion that we should just not be teaching this because students will not be able to use it and it's far too challenging, the data from the study don't really support that conclusion. So as a bit of a follow-up, if you will, I sought to specifically hone in on the competence piece using software. So I collected data in 2019 and very early on in 2020, just kind of right pre-COVID, seeking to identify and examine factors associated with helping students to either feel competent using software or to look at what hindered their ability to build competence. And so this study, we included a broader range of students. So these were not just psychology students. And this study also did not focus on R specifically, the sort of broader study. But what I will present on the next slide will be the subset of results specifically for the students who learned R in their course. So it's a much smaller component compared to the larger study. So the data have been collected, but I haven't sort of worked my way through the entire paper yet. So these data are preliminary, but so instead I'm going to present, rather than quantitative data, the results of a thematic analysis specifically for those who learned R. And so for 119 first-year master's students who used R in their course, here I've listed the top 3 themes that students just kind of like provided very openly when being asked what hindered your ability to feel competent with software, and that could be course or not course related, as well as what helped you to feel competent. So the first 2 themes across the sort of hindrance and helping are actually the same, so they just sort of differ in their valence, if you will. And so the first one is really course structure. How is their course set up? If students perceived their course to be way too fast-paced, somewhat disorganized, didn't have enough opportunities to practice, had really high stakes assignments where they didn't get the feedback that they wanted to. This was the number one thing that they brought up, saying this really impacted my ability to feel competent learning and using the software. And then on the flip side, the students who reported that they had a really clear and organized course structure, especially having that opportunity for weekly practice opportunities that were not tied to a really high proportion of their grade. This was the theme that came up time and time and time again about what really helped them to feel competent with R. The next most common theme was just about the experience. So again, these are first-year students in a master's program. So the students who said, I just had no experience with R or any software even close to R. So I either had no experience at all, or maybe SPSS, or maybe Excel, for example. They said just not having that experience was something that was a bit of a hindrance for them. Whereas students who said, I have some previous experience with R specifically, or a syntax-based software like SAS or Python or something like that, that provided them with a little bit of a boost. The third most common theme for the hindrance versus helping did differ, where for the hindrance, it was really troubleshooting errors or debugging issues in R that came up a fair amount. Whereas the third most common theme that helped students was having a helpful, accessible, or passionate professor, and having what students perceived to be a poor professor was actually the fourth most common theme for the hindrance category. So in terms of things on this list, I think that there's a lot of information that we can think about as instructors to help move things along and help our students to feel competent. And the lack of previous experience or having previous experience component, to me, also speaks to the importance of starting software early, so that you have to start somewhere. And then once you have that little bit of basics, it's easy to kind of build on top or layer that knowledge over different courses or over time. So I'm going to highlight a few additional sort of research studies or case studies, if you will, in terms of incorporating in R, because there's not really a ton of research on this topic, especially in psychology. So this one is from a poster that was presented by a psychology group at the University of Glasgow, where they had a poster that you can sort of find if you Google it, and I reference it at the end, that specifically examined whether allowing undergrads to choose to use R or SPSS, whether that affected, whether there were really differences in their competency and anxiety. And so what these folks found was that students who chose to use R felt more competent with statistics at the end of their course compared to students who chose to use SPSS. And interestingly, the students also who use R also reported less anxiety. Now, this is not a randomized control, these are self-selected groups. So I think that we have to be sort of cautious in what we conclude from this. It's probably more likely that the students who are more anxious chose what they perceived to be as the easier sort of software option. And so the students who chose to use R were maybe already kind of at a different stage, or maybe had more previous experience or something like that. But the authors argue that the confidence gained through a deeper understanding of analysis through R was sort of relevant to that particular group. And so a little bit more about this group in particular, I think they sort of function almost as an interesting case study for success incorporating R into an undergrad stats program curriculum. So this Psych group at the University of Glasgow, they have tons of open materials on their website. And if you're somebody that has some influence, or you're looking to convince some of your colleagues to incorporate R at the undergrad or grad level, but this is particular to undergrad, I'd highly recommend checking out their sort of story and the materials that they put forth. And also one of the instructors in that program has a blog post called "No More Excuses, R is Better Than SPSS for Psychology Undergrads, and Students Agree." So I don't think that that's necessarily the case for all programs, but highly recommend reading that perspective if you're interested in sort of seeing more about R versus SPSS in particular. And then the last one that I want to highlight in terms of some research in this area, that Rode and Ringel had a paper where they had 2 separate introductory psych statistics courses of about 40 students each. And then they examined students' levels of anxiety and confidence in interpreting output from either R or SPSS. So one of the classes tended to focus their sort of materials on R, and the other one focused more on SPSS, but both courses were given output in R and SPSS for the study and asked to sort of rate their anxiety and confidence. And so what these researchers found was that at the very beginning of the class, students reported more anxiety and less confidence with interpreting the R output compared to the SPSS output. But by the end of the course, this difference just disappeared. And it didn't matter whether they were in the R course or whether they were in the SPSS course. Overall, what they found was that students were able to adapt to the R output just as well as the SPSS output. So they didn't really learn how to use the software or look at their competence or anything like that. It was solely in the study of looking at how they interpret the output. So given all of these different research findings and topics that I'm describing, what am I arguing that instructors who are considering incorporating R into their courses, what should they be aware of? Well, the first thing is, I think it's really important with, if you're going to incorporate R into your course, you need to set really clear expectations up front. So yes, it is a programming language. There are going to be some sort of differences from what they're maybe used to, and making sure that students kind of know some of this stuff up front is really important, specifically around lessons, tips, training, tricks, whatever you want to call them, in debugging and troubleshooting. So I think getting an error message is something that is really jarring for students in the beginning when they first get going and they don't realize that this is just sort of a natural part of the process. So making sure that you incorporate in training and information about how to do that is something that should absolutely be considered. Further, providing really accessible notes, examples, and opportunities for students to practice, especially with low stakes assignments, is something that students report really helping them to build up a level of competence. I also think it's really important to emphasize collaboration. Although it wasn't presented in the data that I showed with the qualitative themes, working with others or having peer resources or other opportunities to interact with folks who have different knowledge bases than they do was something that students also emphasized. And overall, I think sort of a takeaway message is that students will rise to the challenge. So I'm not trying to make the argument that everybody should switch to R and that absolutely R should be used in every class. But I think the evidence that, just having some evidence against that argument, that it just should absolutely not be used, students will hate it, it's too hard, and they won't get anything out of it, and they just can't understand it. I don't think the data support that. If you're a student, what should you know about learning R if that's something that you're going into a course doing? Mistakes and errors are inevitable. And of course, learning software takes time and a lot of practice. And it's important for students to remember that even experts have to frequently use search engines or different forums or things like that for troubleshooting and reviewing syntax. And furthermore, even though R is technically a programming language, you don't need to be a programming pro or expert in order to be able to build up a high enough level of competence using R for things like data analysis or data visualization. And lastly, there's a lot of free great resources to help you out. So my concluding thoughts on the topic, you always have to answer your question if you have a question in your title. So is R worth it? I do think it is, yes. What are some of the sort of reasons behind that aside from some of the things that I presented? First and foremost, I think it can't be emphasized enough that R is free and open source and stable. And if we're thinking about topics like reproducibility and replicability and transparency, and a lot of these different open science principles with data sharing and code sharing, R is going to be really great for that. And it's going to help students to be able to incorporate in those open science elements into their own research. There's tons of resources available for free for how to use our training, YouTube videos. Danielle Navarro deserves a special shout out for her free textbook, Learning Statistics with R, and all the work that she's done in this area. Andy Field in his talk, talked about all of the different videos and resources that he puts out that are really great for making this accessible in addition to his textbook. And I also argue that the skills that students build learning are useful both within and outside of academia. Within academia, R is becoming more popular. And as you move to more advanced analyses, there are going to be some things that you just can't do in SPSS anymore. Or that you can't do in Excel or some of the other sort of software packages. And some of the programming skills built, the troubleshooting, critical thinking skills, a lot of these types of things that are maybe second tier to what happens when students are engaging with this software, that's going to help them in non-academic positions as well. So psychology students can handle it, and there are many of them who do like it, but the key really is to make sure that folks are in a supportive and collaborative learning environment. So I'd like to finish my talk with some brief acknowledgements, specifically the financial support that I was provided for that second study that I mentioned, which came from Ryerson University Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching. I'd like to thank a number of research assistants who have been involved in one or both of the projects: Linda Farmas, Heather Davidson, Marina Ryan, Daniela Halili-Sachenko, and Danielle Baines. And lastly, I would like to thank the conference organizers, Kevin Peters, Fergal O'Hagan, Rob Kribbe, as well as the support from Linda Farmas, Natalie Barabisky, and Matt Brown for really helping out to put on this fantastic two-day conference. So I have the references at the end, which you can get from my slides that I posted in the chat. And at this point, I'm going to open the floor for sort of questions specific to this talk before transitioning into the more sort of discussion and panel-based Q&A session.